Hello and welcome to this lecture on pioneers and the Oregon Country. In this lecture, we'll talk about the next wave of immigration to the Oregon Country. So, just to set the stage here, we have the indigenous peoples who have lived on these lands for centuries. It is their ancestral homeland. But beginning in the 18th century, the 1700s primarily, we have groups of non-indigenous peoples who begin to come out here, and we tend to think of them as historians as waves. Wave number one were the explorers. The explorers came, they charted, they mapped, they made claims to the land for their respective countries, but settlement was relatively sparse and very rarely permanent. Wave number two were the fur trappers and fur traders. This wave was small, but resulted in physical settlement. And it resulted in a large economic exchange between indigenous peoples and the greater Western and American world. And they were the first permanent non-indigenous settlements and settlers to the area. The fur trappers and fur traders were also extensions of imperialism and colonialism, thus reflecting the advanced claims of the United States and Great Britain, the two countries that now have joint occupation agreement with respect to this area. Before we move on to the next wave, which are the missionaries, which we talked about in the previous lecture, I just want to point something out. Overall, during the first waves, exploration and explorers and the fur trade industry and the fur trappers and traders, there was relatively little conflict with indigenous peoples. That's not to suggest that there weren't conflicts and violence, but overall those were limited from the evidence that we have, and most scholars attribute this to the fact that indigenous peoples felt quite strongly that they were getting something of value out of this relationship. Trade in goods that they could not acquire for themselves in their own territories. That doesn't mean that destructive things weren't introduced to indigenous populations. Because of this fur trapping and fur trading, new diseases were brought to indigenous populations that had devastating consequences for their tribal membership, for their tribal numbers, for the overall population. Additionally, goods like alcohol were brought in that had destructive consequences for indigenous peoples. And indigenous peoples weren't aware, simply because they didn't have the broader context, that the fur traders and trading companies were essentially an extension of imperialism and colonialism and imperial claims. With the arrival of the missionaries, we're starting to see the seeds of the much later developments and the much later tragedies to befell indigenous peoples as a result of this encroachment in relationship. The missionaries were interested in changing lifestyle and culture. Yes, the Catholic missionaries were willing to let more of indigenous culture remain, but they were still trying to change behavior, trying to make them Christian. The Protestant missionaries had a much larger agenda, a much fuller agenda in terms of how they wanted to change lifestyle. And they weren't coming for economic benefit. They were coming to, in their mind, save souls and transform lives. Things that indigenous peoples did not think that they needed. They felt their souls were in great shape because of the traditional religions they practiced and believed in and were attached to. And they had no desire to change their traditional ways of life. But we're starting to see the seeds of later conflict. But the missionaries are a small number of people. And even their small number is causing agitation among the tribes out here. What we're going to see with the pioneers. And pioneer is just a blanket term used by writers and historians to refer to homesteaders and farmers and miners and town builders and a whole host of people who are going to come out here and settle. So with the pioneers, we're talking about the final phase, which are people who are coming explicitly to take land and resources for their own economic benefit, and that will inevitably come at the expense of the indigenous people and their ancestral homelands. That's what we're talking about. This is just the next phase in this expansionist imperialist story. And it begins to take place in the 1840s. So let's begin that conversation. By the 1840s, we are in the era that historians refer to as manifest destiny. Manifest destiny is simply a clear articulation. It's a clear articulation of the expansionist and imperialistic desires of the United States that had existed in the prior decades since the founding of the country. So for me as a historian, it's a little bit strange that we make such a big deal of this era of manifest destiny, because I would argue that this is just an articulation of the themes and sentiments and spirit that we saw in previous decades. But nonetheless, this is something that history books often make a big deal of, so we should think about it. So manifest destiny is something that scholars describe as occurring in the 1840s all the way through the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. It is a term used to describe the era of westward expansion. And it reflects the fact that although there had been westward expansion in the decades before, we're now entering the intense phase of America's westward expansion, where they're really going to expand to the lands across west of the Mississippi River and go right across to the Pacific Ocean. So we're now in the intense phase of westward expansion. It's not that we haven't had it before, because of course we have. We've talked about it. We've explored it. But now we get this intensity. If you're curious of a definition of the term manifest destiny and where it comes from, let's talk about that a little bit. The basic principle of manifest destiny is that the Americans are a special people. So it's very nationalistic and hyper-patriotic. And that Americans have the responsibility, right, and destiny to subdue the North American continent. So it's openly expansionist, openly imperialistic. It gets its term from an essay published by a widely published essay that was published in newspapers in 1845 by a gentleman named John O'Sullivan, who was a thinker about issues of expansion, and he was a promoter of westward expansion. And in this essay in 1845, he articulates this term manifest destiny. But he'd been openly pushing for this since 1839, so it's not as if this is a new idea even by his standards. But it's this essay in 1845 in which he calls it the manifest destiny of the American people to subdue the West. That's where historians draw the term for this era of, say, 1840 to the 1880s when describing what happens in the American West. So, the Oregon Country is part of this story because, of course, we're in the Pacific Northwest. We're in that Western territory that is to be expanded to and subdued. And so, we're part of this process. Now recall, we have the Agreement of Joint Occupation with the British, established in 1818, renewed in 1827. It's not inevitable that this is going to be part of the United States because of those agreements. And keep in mind, the British are in Canada. Canada is still a British colony. We tend to forget that. But Britain has a presence in the Americas. It's Canadian possessions, and it has territory in the Caribbean. Britain is here. And you could argue that Britain has the stronger claim and an inside track to the Oregon Country because, of course, the Hudson's Bay Company, this large, wealthy, powerful company, is located here with lots of different fur trading posts, including the largest non-Indigenous settlement, Fort Vancouver. And yet, it is the 1840s that sees the bulk of the Oregon Country end up in American possession. And the reason for that is the Oregon Trail. The Oregon Trail results in massive migration to this region. So then that begs the question, A, how was the Oregon Trail formed? And B, why was it formed? Excuse me. And C, what were the consequences of the trail? Well, let's explore that. Let's go through that. In terms of the development of the Oregon Trail and its popularization, we need to think about 5 major factors. 5 major factors. You can see them listed here. Oregon promoters, fur traders and missionaries, Panic of 1837, Jason Lee and Marcus Whitman, and then John C. Fremont. These things are very, very important. So we need to think about them. We need to have a conversation about each of them. So let's begin. The first factor you need to be aware of is the Oregon promoters. If nothing else, the Oregon promoters were responsible for keeping the Oregon country in the mind of the general public. So keeping the Oregon country in the mind of the general public. Okay? The Oregon promoters kept this issue in the minds of the public, so the public didn't forget that the Oregon country existed. That was their major value. So that when the conditions arose that allowed for the migration to this area, then there was the seed planted in the minds of people. The Oregon promoters helped keep things in the public consciousness for when there was both a practical, pragmatic trail and the need to travel across it, or at least the mass desire to travel across it. Second factor in the formation of the Oregon Trail are the fur trappers, fur traders, and the missionaries. When the Oregon promoters started their work, there were some fur trading settlements out in the Oregon country, but that was about it, and those were few and far between. And the only real way to get to the Oregon country was by boat. And you had to basically go from the east coast of the United States, and you had to go south, the entire length of North America, Central America, and South America, round Tierra del Fuego, and then head north up the length of those continents. It was a long journey, it was a dangerous journey, and it was an expensive journey. An incredibly expensive journey. As a consequence of this very, very expensive journey, few people made that journey. The missionaries made it because they had the funding of mission boards that sponsored this kind of activity. But wealthy people didn't have to make the journey. They had no desire to. If they wanted to have business opportunities in the Oregon country, they just paid for those business opportunities. And less affluent individuals, middle class and working class and poorer groups who might have wanted to come out here and start a new life, well, they simply couldn't afford to get out here by sea. It was an expensive and dangerous journey. But with the fur trappers and the missionaries out here, 2 things happened. One, there were more settlements of non-indigenous peoples, and those settlements encouraged additional settlement. In other words, their very presence out here acted as kind of magnets and meccas to draw other people. It didn't feel like you were going out where there were no other Americans or Europeans, that there were pockets of them there. And that simply provided comfort and stability in the eyes of many who might want to make the journey out here. But the other factor with the fur traders and missionaries is that they knew the routes. They knew the resources. They knew the land. They had practical firsthand information. And that became significant because when people started to want to make the overland journey and bring wagons, these individuals had the firsthand knowledge on the ground to be able to guide them. And in fact, what basically happens is fur trading posts and mission sites will act as stopping points on the Oregon Trail. And the missionaries, but especially the fur trappers, like the mountain men that we talked about in the with the Rocky Mountain Fur Company and during the fur trading lectures, those mountain men will have the practical knowledge to create the Oregon Trail, to find the paths through the mountains and through the deserts. And effectively what's going to happen is that the Oregon Trail is going to be completed and created not in an organized, planned fashion, but by simply fur trappers, fur traders, and missionaries linking up trading posts and mission sites into a continuous path from St. Louis, well, technically Independence, Missouri, but St. Louis all the way to Fort Vancouver. It's their practical knowledge that becomes significant. But you can promote the land all you want, and you can have the basis for an infrastructure for an overland route in place, ready to be utilized, but you still need conditions that push people to make this journey. Push them to go west. That event happens in 1837. In 1837, you have something called the Panic of 1837. This is really strange. I don't know why we do this, but oftentimes in the 19th and early 20th century, we call economic depressions panic. And I don't think that's particularly helpful because they're economic depressions. The United States entered a severe economic depression in 1837. The reasons for this are not important for this particular class. You can take a United States History 1 class if you want to explore that. But the United States enters this economic depression in 1837. Widespread loss of farms, widespread homelessness, widespread loss of jobs. And suddenly you have tens of thousands of people who are looking to make a fresh start. And they think traveling west to the Louisiana Territory or to the Oregon country, that might be the solution to start over, to have some land and stability and security. And that's when they remember these stories of the Oregon promoters. Go west where the land is fertile. It's a new Eden. That's when they remember there's missionaries out here. So it's not like you're going to somewhere where there's not quote unquote Christian civilization. The missionaries are out there. And then you have fur trading posts and mission sites and fur trappers who can act as guides. And suddenly the conditions for the Oregon Trail are there. You just need some final leadership, some final guides, some final information. And that's what we'll talk about with number 4 and 5 on this list. Number 4 is Jason Lee and Marcus Whitman. If you recall, Jason Lee was a Methodist missionary we talked about in the previous lecture. And Marcus Whitman was a doctor, cum missionary leader who founded Wailatpu Mission near what is now Walla Walla. If you recall, neither of these groups had particularly good relationships with local tribes, and none of them had had much success converting Native Americans. And as a consequence, Protestant missionaries began to see their role as shifting. They were no longer out there to convert Native peoples. In their mind, Native peoples were a lost cause. Now that's racist. I want you to be clear. That's a racist sentiment. But that's what they think, is that Native peoples are never going to embrace Christianity. So then what you're talking about is then preparing the land for American civilization. Protestant missionaries began to see their role as preparing the land for American civilization. Now that is ethnic cleansing. What they're basically beginning to believe is that instead of converting Native Americans, they'll just push them out. Because what's going to happen is they're preparing the ground for other settlers who are just going to displace indigenous peoples. That is ethnic cleansing, where you're cleansing people from the land. And ethnic cleansing is part and parcel and a precursor to genocide, where you're targeting people because of their race or ethnicity for who they are and removing them and killing them. And ultimately, that's what happens all across the American West. And the missionaries are beginning to provide the framework for that by effectively arguing that indigenous peoples are never going to convert. And so we just need to prepare the way for quote unquote American civilization. In the Oregon country, what you see happen is this begins in 1838 when Jason Lee basically believes that the only way to Christianize the Oregon country is by bringing Christians out there. So he leaves in 1838, takes a boat, goes back east, and starts bringing out more settlers to settle in the Oregon country. So he goes, in 1838, he goes back east. In 1840, he returns with 36 men and women to start, in his own mind, repopulating the Pacific Northwest. Not a very large number, but it's a start. In 1842, Marcus Whitman receives word from the American Mission Board that they are no longer going to sponsor his mission or the Lapwai mission of the Spaldings with the Nez Perce. They're going to shut Wailatpu and Lapwai down. And the Spaldings and the Whitmans are going to be forced to move to the Shimmikin mission near Spokane. So that's what is being proposed. So Marcus Whitman receives this letter, and letters getting out here either came by boat to Fort Vancouver and then found their right owner, or they came with the fur trappers. So it was not exactly a quick process. There's no formal mail. But that's sort of how he receives this letter. Marcus Whitman immediately decides that he can't allow this to happen, that his mission site is an important step for American civilization out west. So immediately he departs his mission site and goes east to beg the mission board for more time, money, and resources for their work. And when he gets to the American Mission Board back east, he makes the exact argument I've been telling you, which is that yes, we haven't had success converting local tribes, but we're preparing the way for future settlement. You have to allow us to stay open. His argument sways the American Missionary Board. They decide they will continue to fund Lapwai and Wailatpu. Victorious, Whitman begins the journey west. When he arrives in St. Louis, he finds about 900 people and their wagons. 900 people in their wagons sitting in St. Louis, trying to figure out how they're going to get west. And of course, Marcus Whitman knows the way. He brought wagons across in 1836, and he's just traveled this area. He knows the way. He agrees to lead them. And these 900 pioneers become the first official travelers on what will later be known as the Oregon Trail, the trail to the Oregon country. And Marcus Whitman leads them. And what is known in American history as the Great Migration begins. It begins, and Marcus Whitman leads it. Eventually, Marcus Whitman leads these pioneers to his mission site, where the Cayuse in particular, but all the local tribes, are alarmed. You see, when Whitman left in 1842, it was at the height of tensions between the Cayuse and the mission site. And you can imagine what the Cayuse think. They were having problems with the Whitmans. Tensions were high. Conflict was high. Suddenly Marcus disappears and he comes back with 900 people. It looks like an invasion. And this is just the first wave of more and more people coming to settle on indigenous lands. And indigenous peoples are alarmed, and understandably so. Now, what about those that don't have a Marcus Whitman to guide them on the trail? How do they get across? Well, that's where John C. Fremont comes in. John C. Fremont was a United States Army officer. And he was commissioned in 1843 by President John Tyler to travel up and down the Rocky Mountains and look for an appropriate place for a wagon train to move west. He was hired by the United States government to try and figure out how to move wagon caravans out west to the Oregon Country. So he travels, and he eventually publishes a book in 1844 that lays out everything that needs to be done. All the watering holes, all the forts, all the passes, what you're going to have to do for your grazing animals. He basically creates a guidebook for how to travel across the Oregon Country, how to travel the Oregon Trail. And that becomes the standard book that is used by pioneers during the early days of the Oregon Trail. So the Oregon Trail is here. Eventually, 500,000 people are going to travel across the Oregon Trail. It's initially quite small. By 1846, only about 5,000 people have traveled the Oregon Trail. Most of those people have gone to settle in the Willamette River Valley. So from south of Fort Vancouver, basically from what is Portland now, south to what is Salem. That's where most people are beginning to settle. But 5,000 changes the population dynamics out here. It means that American citizens are now outnumbering British subjects by a lot. There's a presidential election in 1844. The candidate who wins this election in 1844 is a gentleman named James K. Polk. James K. Polk. And James K. Polk ran on a outright expansionist policy. His most famous campaign slogan that was widely repeated as he was running for president was 54-40 or fight. 54-40 or fight. Some of you might be like, what is that? What's 54-40? Well, they're latitude coordinates on a map. 54-40 was the northern boundary of the Oregon Country as described in the Joint Occupation Agreements of 1818 and 1827. 54-40 would put you like basically halfway north. It would be halfway up north into what is now British Columbia. So it's a pretty large chunk. And James K. Polk ran on a campaign that said 54-40 or fight, meaning that the United States gets the entire Oregon Country or we're going to go to war with Britain. That was his campaign slogan. He ran on that, and he won the election. And as a consequence of winning that election, the expectation was that he would deliver on that promise. Now, almost immediately, he's going to begin negotiations with Britain. To be clear here, the United States cannot win a war with Britain in 1844. Britain is at the height of its power in 1844. The sun never set on the British Empire. They are the most industrialized nation in the world. They have the world's strongest navy. They have one of the world's strongest armies. They are the richest nation on the planet. They have the largest empire in the world. The United States is not going to win a war with Great Britain in 1844. That was bluffing. But the thing to remember is British imperial aims have shifted by the 1840s. They're now interested in Asia. They have complete control over the Indian subcontinent. They have territories in Southeast Asia. They're highly active in China and carving out spheres of influence for themselves in China. And they're pretty active in Africa and the Near East. Britain's colonial objectives have changed. They're no longer as interested in North America. And as a consequence, the Oregon Country doesn't mean as much to them. It means a lot to the Hudson's Bay Company and to many British subjects in Canada, but it doesn't mean as much to parliamentary policymakers, to military policymakers, and to wealthy industrialists in Britain who have political influence. And so Britain isn't really concerned about fighting over or claiming the Oregon Country. And so negotiations are engaged in. And then by 1846, the Treaty of Oregon is signed. The Treaty of Oregon is signed. And in the Treaty of Oregon, they agree to basically extend the 49th parallel, which had been the border between British Canada and the United States, to the Rocky Mountains. They agree to extend that all the way to the Puget Sound. When they get to the Puget Sound, the line dips below Vancouver Island because the British wanted to keep Vancouver Island. Now, in the San Juan Islands, which are in the Puget Sound, there were some disagreements over ownership. That wasn't actually clearly decided which islands were part of Canada and which islands were part of the United States. And that will lead in the 1870s to something called the Pig War, which is literally a war over a pig. But it's not really a war. It's just a conflict over a pig. We'll talk about it, but it's more famous than it's actually of consequence. But nonetheless, we'll chat about it. But the main border is decided, and the vast majority and bulk of the Oregon Country went to the United States. The Hudson's Bay Company blames John McLaughlin for this. So John McLaughlin is blamed for this, and rather than go to British Canada, he chooses to stay and eventually will become an American citizen. But now there has to be an exchange of people. Any American citizen that has found themselves north of the 49th parallel or on Vancouver Island has to get south of those. And any British subject that finds themselves in the south of that has to leave or find themselves under American law and in American territory. The Treaty of Oregon is the process by which the United States claims the bulk of this country. It's now officially part of the United States. This map here shows you the Oregon Trail. Now, the Oregon Trail was never a unified trail. It's a bunch of branch trails. Here's the basic trajectory of it from Independence, Missouri, although for the most people it started at St. Louis. It goes to Oregon City, which is technically the quote-unquote end of the trail. If you go there today, you'll find a big end of the trail memorial. But the reality is most people stopped at Fort Vancouver and then went from there. So Fort Vancouver is really kind of like the ending point, although Oregon City technically claims that to this day. But there's the basic Oregon Trail. You can see here on the slide everything I talked about with respect to the Treaty of Oregon. So it just summarizes what I talked about. Now this is part of the United States. The United States has to decide what to do with it. That's what we'll talk about in the next lecture. All right, I thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.